Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and it's time to start the second day of the USFL and XFL Dispersal Draft team recaps. The first one we're going to be looking at today is the Memphis Showboats, a team who many people think had the single best draft of all 8 teams. So let's see who they picked. The first pick is Jonathan Adams, wide receiver of the Breakers. The trend you'll notice is that the Showboats decided to draft a lot of Breakers. It makes sense considering the Breakers head coach, John DiFilippo, is now the head coach of the Showboats. As for Adams this past season, he was a very solid receiver, 7th in receiving yards and tied for 6th in receptions. He wasn't an insane star, but he was a very solid player on this team, and it's definitely going to be a really solid option to have as one of the wideouts. It's just he's not even the only receiver that's really good that the Showboats drafted. Very solid pick. Then we have D. Anderson, a receiver that ended up having 2 receiving TDs, but only did have 13 receptions. But in those 13 receptions, he ended up having 174 yards. Averaging over 13 yards per reception is pretty incredible, and having 2 TDs is always good. And considering the fact that DiFilippo brought him, it means that DiFilippo sees something in him, so it's a very solid addition to bring him back to the Showboats as well. And then we have another New Orleans Breaker in Jordan Brailford. Now, the only thing with Brailford is that he was on the Breakers defense. And when you have a defense that has guys like Vontae Diggs and Gerard Fernandez, you're going to kind of go under the radar, and that's kind of what he did. He only had 19 tackles at the linebacker spot, but he did have 3 TFLs as well as 2 sacks and a pass defended. So he has shown that he is a legit player. It's just that he was on a defense that had a ton of high-end talent. So maybe in Memphis he'll have some more time to actually showcase how good he is. So we finally get to a non-breaker in Kennedy Brooks. Kennedy Brooks was one of the biggest free agent signings during the offseason of any team. This is a guy that was very solid at college and signed to the Philadelphia Stars during the offseason. The Showboats adding him is going to be a great piece as he's going to be a great depth running back. Yes, I said depth running back. You'll see later why. The bottom line is Kennedy Brooks is going to be a very solid addition to the Showboats team. They ran the ball a lot really well this past season, so it's no shock that they decided to get a couple guys. Then how about another breaker in Connor Christian? Connor Christian was a defensive tackle that was a solid player. 16 tackles, 2 TFLs, 1.5 sacks. Dude, again, he was on a team that had a lot of high-end talent, so he wasn't able to showcase all of what he could do, but he was a very solid guy. And adding him to a team that already has arguably one of the best DTs in John Atkins makes sense. Here's the big one, Case Cookus. Yeah, this is the guy that pretty much has been unanimously viewed as the single best player available in either the USFL or XFL draft. I know some would say Ja'Cour Pearson, but I think most people look at Cookus as the number one guy that was available. And it's no shocker that the Showboats took him. Everybody's pretty much known that the Showboats decided to take him with the first overall pick they had. The fact is with Cookus is that this dude is a monster. This past season was a down year for him. He had an awful offensive line. And with that, he still put up the second most passing yards, the 5th best completion percentage, 2nd most passing TDs. Though he was tied for 2nd in interceptions and fumbles, but he had the 6th best passer rating while having an absolutely atrocious offensive line. Even running the ball, he finished 11th in rushing yards, had 5.5 yards per carry. I mean, this dude was insane this past year, and this is coming off a major leg injury as well. He's going to have a full offseason where he's fully healthy this year, and he's going to be on a team with a much better offensive line. The fact is that Cookus very well could be the best quarterback in the UFL next year or this year, because this dude's already proven that he is elite, and now he's going to have a much better team than he's had either 2 years he's been with Philly. So a very solid addition to the Showboats, one of the best draft picks any team had. And then we have DJ Daniel, an all underappreciated all USFL cornerback from the Generals. He was all USFL. Part of it was because he was tied for 2nd in interceptions and tied for 8th in passes defended. Dude was pretty underrated. The Generals' defense as a whole pretty much got forgotten about last year just because of how bad the team was for most of the season. But DJ Daniel was still one of the best players at his position in the USFL, and it's why he was an all-USFL player. Getting a really great cornerback for the Showboats is a really great addition. The Showboats, while having a very solid defense, nobody really looked at them and said they have a lot of star power, just that they were a really solid unit. So getting a guy like DJ Daniel is getting some star power to the team. Very great addition. Then how about another huge one in another breaker in Vontae Diggs? Vontae Diggs, as I talked about before, was insane this past year. I believe he got snubbed on the USFL 50. I think that they did him a real dirty by putting him as I think it was the 6th best linebacker in the league this past year. I had him as the 4th best. 69 tackles, 2.5 sacks, 3 interceptions. I mean, that's pretty incredible. He was in the top for interceptions. He was seventh in tackles, tied for eighth in TFLs, tied for eighth in passes defended. I mean, the guy was a monster. I mean, being tied for second in interceptions as a linebacker while also being top 10 in tackles and TFLs and having 2.5 sacks. Diggs was still incredible this past season. The fact is, going to Memphis is going to be huge for them. This is an instant boost to their defense. They're getting a true leader that's going to help that defense get even better. Then we have Jerry Elder, another player from the Breakers, this time at the safety position. Tied for seventh in interceptions, tied for eighth in passes defended. Look, it makes sense that the Showboats drafting Breakers, not only because of the fact that, hey, John DeFilippo is their coach, but also the Breakers statistically have been technically the best defense both years in the USFL. So getting these guys that have played there both years or even 1 year makes sense. So Elder fits right into that. Great pick. Then we have another really solid, underappreciated linebacker in Colin Hill. Hill is very much, again, a product of the Generals. Tied for third in forced fumbles with 2. Was tied for eighth in TFLs. Tied for seventh in sacks as a linebacker. 4.5 sacks, 6 TFLs, 37 tackles, and 4 passes defended. It's just, again, he was on the Generals team that also had Chris Orr on it, who was the only defender that really got all the appreciation he deserved this past year. So when you forget about Orr, you realize that, yeah, there were a couple other really good players on this team, and Hill is one of them. Then we start with the very few offensive linemen the Showboats picked, and Kurt Kelly, offensive guard from the Breakers. Breakers O-line was pretty much like the second best unit, arguably third behind the Stallions. We all knew the Generals was number 1. So I'm not surprised that they're, getting offensive linemen from the Breakers if they had the choice. John DeFilippo's guys make sense. Then DeAndre Overton. He went to the Maulers during the offseason, but he played the last couple of years on the Stars. This past season, he was 17th in receiving yards at 337. He did have less than 100 yards after catch, but he did have 30 receptions total and 2 touchdowns. A really solid addition to the wide receiver position. Getting Cookus some insane weapons makes sense, and getting him one of his receivers also makes sense. Getting him a guy he's played with for the past couple of years. Really like this move. Then we have Vinny Papale. Yep, he is coming back to Memphis. So he was with the Bandits, then he stayed to go to the Showboats, then he went to the Breakers in the offseason, to John DeFilippo's team, and now is back to both John DeFilippo's team and Memphis. Gotta love it. 14th in receiving yards, tied for 9th in receiving TDs. Was the number 1 receiver here. Makes sense that he's back. This team's going to have a really solid wide receiver core. Though I personally think it's going to be just solid. It still is a really solid receiving core. It's not going to have any of those insane number 1 receivers in my opinion. But it's going to be filled with a lot of guys that could be wide receiver 2 on a lot of teams. Derek Dillon, Vinny Papale, Jonathan Adams, DeAndre Overton. None of these guys scream insane number 1, but they all scream really good wide receiver 2. So getting like 4 of those guys on a team, it's going to be scary. Then we have Terry Poole, offensive tackle on the Maulers. Terry Poole played on both the Generals and Maulers the past couple of years. Another offensive lineman. He did play in the Generals in the first year and the Maulers last year. The Maulers' offensive line was okay, but it makes sense. The Showboats want to get an O-line that can protect Cookus, so getting pretty much anyone they can, and just getting guys to compete for the job makes sense. Then we have Tashawn Render, another underappreciated guy in the Generals' defense, 3.5 sacks, 4 TFLs. It's just another guy that's going to be a really solid presence up front, getting to the quarterback. It makes sense to get a guy like this, a guy that's very under the radar, and on a team that has a lot more high-end talent, like the Breakers are building. I mean, the Showboats are building. Man, I call them the Breakers. I mean, they've pretty much drafted almost all their players from there. So I like this pick. Then we have Shaheed Salman, another Breaker. Yeah, another one. 21 tackles, 5 TFLs, a forced fumble, a pass defended. Just a solid linebacker. Not going to be your all USFL or all UFL type of player, but it's going to be a really solid guy to have at the linebacker position. Again, he's been with John DeFilippo. Makes sense that he's joining him in Memphis. Then we have Wes Saxton Jr., another Generals tight end that's been drafted. That makes it 3. Another guy that probably is going to be used a lot more in the run blocking schemes than he is pass catching, as he's only had 6 receptions, though it was for 70 yards, which is really solid. But I'd imagine he's going to be used more in the run blocking scheme and to help them run. And then we got Sage Surratt, because this is the receiving tight end. Yeah, I said they didn't have a number 1 receiver. Well, it's technically still true because he's not a receiver, but At tight end, you have Sage Surratt, who was third in receiving yards, tied for second in receptions, and first in yards after catch. He's going to be the number one target for Case Cookus. Even though he's a tight end, much like Travis Kelce with the Chiefs, Surratt is going to be the number one receiver on this team while being tight end. I said back in 2022 this guy was going to be great. It took a year, but I ended up being right about this guy. He was incredible this past season with MBT. Oh, man. For a lot of the season, it was between him and Sternberger, who got the All-USFL nod. Ended up going to Sternberger just barely, but Surratt was still incredible. First in yards after catch as a tight end, first in receptions. This guy was a great safety blanket, but he was also great at just going downfield because he used to be a receiver. So he knows how to go downfield and get those great yards after catch, while also being great as what a tight end's supposed to be, which is a safety blanket. This guy's going to be great for the Showboats. Huge ad. So is this one. Darius Victor. You know, when people say the Showboats had the best draft, they point to Cookus, Surratt, and Victor, and Diggs. I agree with that. Because Darius Victor is become, for some reason, underrated all of a sudden. Everybody's just forgetting how good this guy is, which is insane. I mean, really, I'm seeing people making a huge deal about, like, Reggie Corbin being left off the Panthers roster, or how Wes Hills is like, oh man, he was like the best running back available in the draft. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I've always been a Victor fan. I think Vito is the second best running back that USFL had to offer. I think he was better than Wes Hills. Third in rushing yards, third in yards per rush, tied for fourth in rushing TDs, tied for fourth in fumbles, which is bad, tied for third in scrimmage yards. 189 yards receiving, was 31st in the league. He had 3 receiving TDs, tied for 9th in the league. So he had 7 total touchdowns. I mean, he's never had a season where he's had nearly the amount of attempts of guys ahead of him. Wes Hills was the league leader in rushing yards, but I don't want to beat a dead horse, but as I've said before, it's a very, very skewed stat because really Victor was much better at running, considering the fact that Victor had like 80 less carries, yet was only within 200 yards of Wes. So this is a huge ad for the Showboats. Then last we have Sidney Wells, offensive tackle from the Breakers. He signed on to the Breakers during the offseason to go there next year, and now he's to the Showboats. Again, another guy that John DeFilippo wants to bring to Memphis. So overall, do I agree that the Showboats had this insane draft? Yeah, I do. Do I think it is the best draft? I'd have to think on that. I think there's a very good argument they had the single best draft available. The fact is that they took full advantage of the teams they had available to them. I'm not going to go into full detail, but the fact is the USFL Dispersal draft was much better than the XFL Dispersal draft just because a lot of the good teams from the USFL didn't make it, whereas you really only had the Roughnecks that were and Sea Dragons for the XFL side, whereas the USFL side, you had teams like the Generals and Stars, which were high-end talent teams, just not depth teams, whereas like the Vipers and Guardians didn't even have high-end talent for that much. So the USFL Dispersal Draft had a lot more talent in it, and the Showboats took full advantage of that. You're telling me that a team got the best quarterback available, I think the best running back available, I think arguably the best linebacker available, and they were able to draft the best tight end available. That's crazy. The Showboats had an excellent draft. So be on the lookout for the next one. We've got 3 more that will be coming out today. We still have to do the Battlehawks. We still have to do the Brahmas. And, of course, we still have to do the next team that's coming out today, the Michigan Panthers. So be on the lookout for that. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Have a great night.